About 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a sermon that was basically the main topic of it is why would God allow suffering? Why would He allow suffering in our lives? If He loves us as much as He says He does, why would He allow those things to happen to us? The new sermon series that we're getting ready to start is going to ask a different question. It's not going to ask why God allows suffering. It's going to ask, where is God in the midst of suffering? This new sermon series is called The Acts of God. And it's about a 7-week sermon series. It's going to be broken up a little bit because we've got Easter coming up and we got a couple of other things. But today's the first one. It's tough to continue trusting God when your family life is far from ideal. Why doesn't God answer our prayer for children, for health, for harmony, and contentment in the home? Sometimes really good people have really bad problems at home. And it's not easy to explain why. That's why I'd like to focus on Joseph this morning, one of my favorite Old Testament characters. 15 chapters of Genesis are devoted to Joseph's life. But there is no obvious flaw that is ever recorded against him. He was not perfect, but Joseph is a very impressive example of a man who was faithful to God in spite of continuous hardships. Now the same can't be said for other heroes of the faith. Noah got drunk. Abraham lied. Jacob was deceitful. Moses killed a man. David committed adultery. But not Joseph. Regardless of how much tragedy he experienced, Joseph kept trusting that God's hand was on him and that God would deliver him. God did. Again and again. Until one day, Joseph was dramatically promoted to second in command of Egypt. It was the most powerful nation of his day. It's a magnificent story that contains a relevant message for us about trusting God in the midst of tragedy. Now, Joseph grew up in what today we would call a dysfunctional family. Counselors have defined a dysfunctional home as one where a lot of hurt is going on that produces a lack of respect and a sense of disintegration. We can define it a little bit simpler. A dysfunctional home is one that isn't functioning the way God intended. God has designed the home to be an oasis of security, love, and harmony. A dysfunctional home is a wasteland of insecurity, loneliness, and disunity. Any family counselor reading the first paragraph of Genesis chapter 37 would throw up many red flags and danger signs, sources of tension within any home. Take, for example, this one. Joseph, being 17 years old. Most parents would admit that teenagers often create tension in the home. Because when kids hit that critical age, they instinctively seek to establish their independence. Even obedient children show signs of pushing back against parental guidance. Combine that natural drive for freedom with hormones that burns within and the intense desire to impress their peers, you've got a formula for conflict. A second phrase that throws up a red flag in Joseph's dysfunctional family is his father's wives, plural. Now, the bizarre story of how Jacob would round up with 2 wives is too involved for us to get into that today, but Jacob fell in love with Rachel, who was a beautiful woman. But on the wedding night, her father substituted her older, less attractive sister, Leah, in a veiled wedding gown. Now, the next day, he explained to Jacob that it was their custom for the older daughter to be married first. So he offered Jacob a deal, a 2-for-1 special. He could marry both girls for just 14 years of servanthood. Jacob had no option. From that moment on, the two sisters was in fierce competition with each other. Eventually, Jacob had 6 sons with Leah, 2 by Rachel, and 4 others by their personal servants. We won't even get into that topic. So the word blended would be a euphemism to describe this home. It was a complex family, agitated by competition and backbiting. Think about it. 2 queen bees cannot exist in the same hive. Jacob's 2 wives were intense rivalry for his attention. And everyone knew that Rachel was his favorite wife. And all the offsprings knew the pecking order. And they resented it. In verse 3, there's another danger sign. It says, now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons. The reason here is pretty obvious. Joseph was Rachel's first son, a son that she and Jacob had longed for and prayed for such a long time. And Joseph was born when Jacob was in old age. He was the 11th boy. Now, parents seem to have the tendency to become more lenient and relaxed as they get older and the more children that they have. The first child, if it drops its pacifier, you will bull it before you ever use it again. The second child, if you drop the pacifier, you might rinse it off a little bit and pluck it right back in. But the third child, if they drop that one, you wipe it off on your sleeve, maybe, and then you give it back to the baby. So since Joseph was Jacob's 11th son, he probably got an easier assignment and experienced greater leniency. Jacob didn't try to hide the fact that Joseph was his favorite. He gave him a decorated robe, a special coat that none of his other brothers ever had. The coat has thought to demonstrate that Joseph was considered the firstborn and would receive double the inheritance. Genesis 37:4 says, but when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him. It's not surprising. They couldn't measure up. They was being treated unfairly. They weren't just jealous, they hated him. They wouldn't speak a kind word to him. This is sibling rivalry at its worst. This was a family that was burdened with problems and one that was heading for disaster. So Joseph was a good man, but he wasn't perfect. There are indications that he sometimes was a little egotistical and flaunted his favorite position. Why else would he relate to his brothers the dramatic dream that he had, a dream of superiority to them? Genesis 37:5-7 says this. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, that my sheaf rose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down my sheep. Now, it doesn't take an intellectual giant to interpret what that dream was. His brother said to him, are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dream and his words. So if God has blessed you with a favored position, spiritually, financially, or intellectually, don't flaunt it. Don't try to deliberately make other people jealous. Be humble. It is better for others to discover your gifts than for you to broadcast them to the world. Now, Joseph's brother said in effect, look, it's one thing that he had this dream, but then he has to come to us and brag to us. He thinks he's better than we are. Now, Joseph should have caught on by this point. However, when he had a second similar dream, he boasted about it also. He said, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Now, common sense by this point would say, Joseph, shut up. Don't antagonize your brothers any farther. Now, maybe Joseph was very naive, and he couldn't imagine that anybody would disapprove of him. Maybe he was an inverted paranoid. He imagined that everybody was out to do him good. He was upbeat. He was positive. He had no idea that he could get on people's nerves. But more than likely, he took delight in deliberately antagonizing his brothers. And his brothers hated him all the more because he was flaunting his dream. Genesis 37, 10 through 11 says, but when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? Now one day, Jacob instructed Joseph to go find his brothers, to take them a care package, to see how they're doing, because they was tending their sheep near Shechem. Now, was Jacob blind to his son's potential for evil by this point? He certainly underestimated their hatred for Joseph, but he should have been aware of the danger. Because a few years earlier, the brothers had brutally murdered all the men in Shechem in retaliation for the clan violating one of their sisters. They took vengeance into their own hand and executed all the men of that city. Maybe that's why they were camping near Shechem a few years later. A lot of single women there. But Jacob casually instructed Joseph, go check up on your brothers. See how they're doing. Now, why would Jacob send his favorite son, only 17 years old, right into harm's way? I think there's a warning here. Parents, grandparents, don't be naive about your kids. They're not as sweet as you think they are. I remember one time my grandmother has always said about me that if I was quiet, it's probably into something. So parents, be smart about your children. Be smart about their potential for good, but also their potential for evil. Because Jacob didn't do this. He naively sent Joseph to visit his violent brothers. So Joseph traveled more than 50 miles and finally spotted them in the pasture near Dothan. Now the brothers saw him coming over the hill and they muttered, here comes the dreamer. In Hebrew, it literally means dream expert. Here comes the dream expert. Here comes the know-it-all. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we will see what becomes of his dreams. Now, dogs in a pack are more dangerous than dogs by themselves. People in a mob usually sink to the level of the lowest participant. They will resort to evil they would never indulge in alone. They brag, they dare, they taunt each other, and pride backs them in a corner, and they do stupid stuff. That happens to a drunk in a bar, a college student at a party, an angry fan at a ball game. The potential for evil is always intensified when people are in large crowds. But only Reuben, the oldest one, mildly protested. Reuben didn't have the courage to tell his siblings that the plot that they had was horrible. He merely suggested an alternative. Don't kill him. Just throw him in a deep cistern. He'll die there, and we won't have his blood on our hands. After all, he is our brother. Now, the Bible does say that Reuben intended to sneak back there later and rescue Joseph when his brothers weren't looking. But when Joseph got into the camp, they began to rough him up, calling him names, bullying him. They ripped off that hated robe, tossed him into a dry cistern, and ignored his cries for help. They were so calloused that they sat down and ate while their brothers was pleading for mercy just a few feet away. They were hardened men. Verse 5 says, "Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. At that point, Judah spoke up and said, 'What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites.' So they lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 12 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt." It just so happened that a caravan of Ishmaelite traders came by at that exact moment. It's amazing, isn't it? I don't think it's a coincidence. I think it's a God incident. There's a number of "it just so happened" moments in the Bible. It just so happened that Isaac's servant was seeking a wife for his master, that Rebekah came to water her father's livestock. It just so happened that Ruth was gleaning in a field owned by Boaz. It just so happened that Samson was tied to the two center pillars of the building where the Philistines were partying. It just so happened that Caesar Augustus issued a decree that all the world should be taxed, and each man had to go to his own city to register. Those are not coincidences. They're God incidences in which the providence of God arranged events to accomplish His will. Don't you wonder how many "it just so happened" incidences occurs in our own life? That God has prearranged? Seemingly chance encounters can result in marriage proposals, occupational changes, mission appointments, or other life-changing events. J. Wallace Hamilton once told of a mother cat with a newborn kitten that was trying to cross a busy New York City intersection. Now, a police officer had seen what was going on, seen her dilemma, and he stopped traffic from both sides. And the cat then darted across the street and down the alley. Hamilton said that cat had no idea that the power of the New York City Police Department had employed to get her safely across. I wonder how many times the mighty arm of God goes up to get us safely to His predetermined destination. And we're not even aware of it. So it just so happened that while Joseph was in the pit, some Ishmaelite traders came by. Now, the Ishmaelites shackled the terrified Joseph and headed south. Meanwhile, his brothers ripped up that garment, put some animal blood on it, and presented it to their father. Now, naturally, Jacob thought that his brother had been, or that his son had been devoured by a wild beast. And he burst into tears, and he grieved to a point that he would not be consoled. Joseph was taken to Egypt, where he was auctioned off as a slave. He was purchased by a man named Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of his security guard. Now, Joseph must have felt betrayed, not only by his brothers, but possibly by his God. The bottom has dropped out of his life. He went from favored son to lowly slave in one day. From sleeping on a feathery mattress to sleeping on a stone floor. From being free to being owned by a strict military officer. What a horrible experience for a teenage boy. At this point, Joseph didn't understand. There was no Gideon Bible in his slave quarters where he could read the end of the story. He had no idea he was going to eventually become second in charge of Egypt. At this point, he's devastated. There is no explanation for what's happened, no hope for escape. This was the worst thing that could have happened. However, the Bible ends. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. There's one simple lesson we should all glean from this account of Joseph's upbringing. It's difficult to be faithful to God if you are reared in a dysfunctional family. But it is possible. Maybe you grew up in an abusive or diversive or unbelieving home. Those earlier impressions have left scars of insecurity, self-hatred, and doubt that's not easily overcome. For example, if your earthly father was difficult to love and respect, it's much more difficult to honor and love your heavenly Father. It's difficult to grow up in a dysfunctional family and be faithful to God, but it is possible. We can focus so much on our past environment and family history that we think we're locked into failure. We blame our parents for our imperfect mistakes. Thank you. And use them to justify multiple of transgressions. Sometimes professional counselors would be good at this point and very helpful. But however, there comes a time you got to forget what is behind and focus on what lies ahead. You have to move on. There comes a time for forgiveness and grace. There comes a time to get your eye off the rearview mirror and look through the windshield of the future. Joseph overcame some horrible circumstances to become a faithful and noble servant of God. He became Egypt's deputy pharaoh. He was successful too. And regardless of the dysfunctional family in which he grew up in, he became successful. But Jesus also grew up in an imperfect family. The Bible speaks of Jesus' father, Joseph, when he was 12. But don't read of him again. When Jesus was crucified, Mary was present, but Joseph was not. So most people have concluded that Joseph died somewhere in Jesus' teenage years. So Jesus knew what it was like to grieve the loss of a parent. He understood what it was like to grow up in a single-parent home. His brothers ridiculed him and initially scoffed him for the idea that he was the Messiah. When Jesus began his ministry, they accused him of being out of his mind. Jesus was faithful to God's purpose because he knew that his loving and heavenly Father knew no favors. He heard his heavenly Father's voice say, "This is my Son whom I am well pleased." Heavenly Father's love is everlasting. It is the same yesterday, the same today, and it's the same forevermore. The spiritual stability can bring increasing confidence and assurance to you also. You can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. So as we come to a close of this sermon, I want to ask you, have you relied on his strength? It says you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. If you've not relied on his strength yet, I'll be honest, I don't know how you've made it. But you can come to him today and rely on his strength, his comfort, and his love. So whatever your choice is, come now as we stand and sing.